Tesla has a plan to convert the world to 100% renewable energy in 20 years for 29% less than the cost of doing nothing. Now you might be wondering, how will they manage that? And does the plan leave anything important out? Hint, yes it does. So on today's episode, as a permaculture urbanist, I'll share some strategies to Edenize the Tesla plan so that everyone in the world can enjoy a much better life while solving the one big sustainability problem that no one talks about. Welcome to Edenicity, best practices for sustainably abundant cities. Let's start with a quick tour of the Tesla master plans, starting with their first secret master plan in 2006. This was during the early days of Tesla, when they were working at a very small scale with small production runs of the Tesla Roadster. This is the 2010 version. Pretty early on, Elon Musk declared his intentions that Tesla was a company that was all about accelerating the switch to renewable energy. And in this very tongue-in-cheek document, he laid out the very serious plan that Tesla had to make electric vehicles the vehicles of choice in the car industry. Now, if this is a little bit before your time, at this point, electric vehicles were really strange hobbyist vehicles, but the Roadster changed that. So in this article, Musk addresses some of the misconceptions that the batteries are especially toxic and that charging them off of the grid would consume more energy than a gas-powered car because it's inefficient to pull it over the electric lines. And he managed to show that that's not true. But in the very end, he really spoke to the top criticism of the Roadster, which is, why is it so expensive? And he said, well, here's our plan. We're going to build a sports car, then use that money to build an affordable car, and then use that money to build an even more affordable car. And while doing all of the above, start providing zero-emission electric power generation options. So that was the secret plan. Don't tell anyone. All right, that's part one. Part two appeared 10 years later. Now, in that 10 years, they had gone to mass production, but were still not in really huge volumes. So the basic plan is to, oh goodness, there's a lot of sales language. The basic plan was to create solar roofs for houses and also integrated battery storage so that you could store and use the energy at night. Expand the electric vehicles to all of the different major segments of cars. Develop self-driving cars and enable your car to be self-earning. That is, if it's self-driving, you could maybe rent it out while you're not using it and maybe get paid by other people to use it. So it's kind of like Lyft or Uber without the driver. So this was in 2016, and all of these capabilities were 1 or 2 years in the future. And of course, to their credit, Tesla has become a giant in the car industry. And the Model 3 outsells the Corolla 2 to 1, even though the Model 3 is still twice as pricey in most configurations. So that's part two. The thing that they did really, really well was expand the product line and dominate the market. On to 2023, Master Plan Part 3, Sustainable Energy for All of Earth. I'm going to go through this plan in detail so that you understand how it's put together and therefore how much more ambitious it could have been. So let's take a look. Okay, as a permaculturist, I've got to stop right here. What we're seeing is a large field of solar panels in the desert, and in the foreground, a battery storage facility, so that the energy gathered by the panels can be used at night. Right away, as a permaculturist, I can see a flaw in this design. Permaculture is applied ecology, and one of the cues that we take from ecology is that nothing does only one thing. So trees provide habitat and mulch and food for many different animals, and they fix nitrogen or gather nutrients. Nothing does just one thing. So in this case, when I see solar panels doing just one thing, the permaculturist in me wakes up and says, hey, let's come up with some additional uses for these panels. Also, there's serious consequences to single-use design. The fact that this is out in the desert means that it's a long way from where the power is being used, which makes it harder to service. As a permaculturist, what I'd like to see is rooftop solar panels. And the question that I'd be asking is, could a city power itself within city limits with rooftop power? But that's an issue for other episodes. Let's get into the details of the Tesla plan. As you can see, this was a team effort, no doubt by industry experts. All right, here's the executive summary. They're going to look at electric demand, figure out how to supply it, and then look at whether there's sufficient materials and investment to actually accomplish that. And here's where they're going with this. It's going to take this much storage, this much power, this much money, $10 trillion worth of investment, and they claim it's reasonably easy to do. Okay, here's the world energy system. This is a Sankey diagram that shows you the energy flows from the sources to conversion, to its uses, to the waste heat and the work that it does. And we've seen diagrams like this earlier in this channel in the Edenicity energy series that I'll link at the end of this episode. The main point to notice here is the total amount of energy input. And then the second most important point is look at how much waste heat there is compared to useful work. It's about a 2-to-1 ratio. So their plan has 6 parts. First is to repower the existing grid with renewables, and by doing that, they get rid of a lot of the waste heat that's produced by fossil fuel power plants. This would be coal and oil and natural gas. This would replace 65 petawatt hours per year of fossil fuel energy with 26 petawatt hours per year of renewable energy, cutting it by more than half. Oh, and by the way, what's a petawatt hour? It's a million billion watt hours, or 10 to the 15th watt hours. Part 2 of the plan is to switch to electric vehicles. Of course, that's what they do best at Tesla. And they show that in doing this, we're going to bring down the demand for total energy by a lot. So a Toyota Corolla that I mentioned earlier uses about 4 times as much energy overall as a Tesla. Step 3 is switch to heat pumps. We've talked about this in the first of the Edenicity energy videos. So the idea of a heat pump, they illustrate it right here, is to bring in your heat source and then using equipment very similar to your refrigerator, using compression and expansion cycles to move it to a heat sink. And it turns out that heat pumps are extremely efficient. They can be generally about 3 times as efficient as combustion or as baseboard heat. And they show that right here. Here's a gas furnace, total energy used versus a heat pump. And this has now become a fairly mature technology. They model the summer and winter demand. So this is the time of day, summer and winter demand. And they look at using heat pumps in the industrial sector for temperatures up to about 200 degrees Celsius. Above that temperature, they lose efficiency. And in the end, switching to heat pumps reduces the energy demand from 12 to 5 petawatt hours per year. Now, bear in mind, as we reduce the demand, we are not reducing the quality of the end product. You're getting just as much heating and just as many miles traveled as you were before. It's just more efficient. Step 4 is to electrify high temperature heat delivery and hydrogen production. So this is looking at industrial processes. And above 200 degrees Celsius, you're basically looking at a process where you heat a thermal storage medium with electricity. And that medium, whether it's steam or hot air or molten salts, here we go, is then capable of storing and delivering the heat where you need it. And it turns out that this whole cycle is about 95% efficient. Now, this turns out to be no more efficient with electricity than using fuels. So it eliminates 9 petawatt hours of fossil fuels, but it creates 9 petawatt hours of additional electric demand. Here's the different thermal storage media. This is a really handy reference. Also, there are applications such as steel production where you need hydrogen. So in those cases, they would just use the electricity to electrolyze water and produce hydrogen. So this takes 8 petawatts of fossil fuel energy and replaces it with 7 petawatt hours per year of electric demand. So there's a little bit of a loss of efficiency, but it's just a tiny bit in this case. Step 5, sustainably fuel planes and boats. Rather than drilling or mining for more fossil fuels, what Tesla proposes is to synthetically manufacture fuels using hydrogen and carbon dioxide from the atmosphere or carbon pulled from carbon capture devices. And this would be carbon neutral because you're just cycling it to and from the atmosphere as you produce the synthetic fuels. So the bottom line here is that it's a one-to-one trade of energy for energy. And then finally, there's all the details of manufacturing the solar and wind generators and the various storage devices. And they get into an amazing amount of detail on that. First, looking at the power grid for the United States as an example of how this might be done in the world. And they look at the total demand picture. We've, on this channel, also looked at similar graphs of demand in the energy series. Then use that to model the supply. So the demand from before appears as this black line on this graph, and this is in gigawatts. And the supply appears in layers, with the bottom layer being nuclear, very thin layer, an even thinner layer of hydro generation, a pretty thick layer of wind generation, which changes, as you can see, from day to day, by kind of a lot. Then a layer of solar generation, which actually produces above the demand line, but what happens is they store as much of it as they can in lithium-ion storage, or hydrogen storage, or thermal storage, that is molten salts and the like. Where's the hydro storage? So they don't have hydro storage in here. And in the past, I've pointed out that there's more than enough capacity to do all the storage using hydro. But in a moment, they'll show you why they didn't make that choice. Okay, so what happens is, even when the storage devices are filled and you've used all of the available solar power, sometimes there's a little bit of extra solar and wind energy that gets curtailed, that just doesn't get used. And in some cases, like on this day here, November 1st, the solar that day really overproduced and they weren't able to utilize it. So if you're building an optimal system, they make the case that there will always be some curtailment, and the most financially efficient system will have some curtailment. This is something that I ran into when I used to build tiny houses. If you have batteries in these tiny houses that are supplied by a solar panel, what happens is that on a clear sunny day, it'll fill the batteries by 10 a.m. But on cloudy days, you're going to need all of that extra battery capacity. So there's always some curtailment in almost any passive energy design. So the curtailment varies from day to day, and they model the amount of generation that's required. And then from that, they come up with how much storage is required. And here's where we run into the problem with pumped hydro. Pumped hydro is very expensive, 270 kilowatt hours versus $19 per kilogram of hydrogen. I wish they'd converted that. So it's decently expensive. And so it just didn't seem to win out in the competition. They look at ways of generating power and what it costs per kilowatt. Solar and wind perform very well compared to most things. And finally put together a complete model for solar energy for the world. One thing I forgot to mention is that in their model, they scaled the US production up to world production by just multiplying US production by 6, which, as I'm going to point out, is actually a problem. So here's the new energy picture. It's about the same amount of energy generation, a little bit of processing to synthetic fuels and stored hydrogen, a little bit less consumption. And even when you add the curtailed renewables, the waste is just a little over half of the useful work that's produced. Remember, the waste heat was much greater under fossil fuels. All right, so now they look at the details. It's characteristic of Tesla to model everything down to the raw materials. So eventually we're going to see that. They look at the fleets. They look at what it would take to electrify all of the batteries, and then they add up the total energy required for each of the 6 steps, repowering the existing grid with renewables, switching to electric vehicles, and so on, to come up with 240 terawatt hours of storage capacity required to pull this off. And similarly, for generation, adding it up from repowering the grid all the way up to sustainably fueling planes and boats, that adds up to 30 terawatts of power generation. All right, so then now that they know how much they need, they can estimate the total investment. And here's where it really gets exciting, because if we do nothing and just simply continue to buy fossil fuels and invest in the technologies involved in extracting them, it'll cost $14 trillion over 20 years. Whereas to convert the entire economy over to sustainable energy over 20 years would cost $10 trillion. This is a really big deal. This means that we would have more money available to do other things. Here's a breakdown of the investments. It adds up to $5 trillion initial investment, $10 trillion overall over 20 years. Now here's that material breakdown that I mentioned earlier. And the cost of the factories, the cost of recycling, yes, full recycling at the highest percent available. And finally, the total land area required for the renewables. You can see these little dots here in North America and South America, a tiny little dot in Africa, a little dot in Europe, a much bigger set of dots in Asia. So this is how much land area would be required to electrify the entire world economy on 100% renewable energy. Okay, now you might be wondering, is there enough material available to produce all those batteries and all of the other infrastructure we're going to need for this? Well, they looked into that. They broke it down element by element and looked at the total amount required and the ore grades available, the process yields, the total amounts of ore that would need to be mined to produce this. And then they compared that to the existing reserves. And you can see that everything was at 20% of existing reserves or below. And they also made the point that We tend to think of the reserves as this zero-sum game where we just draw it down over time, but Tesla makes the claim that over time, what happens is we discover new sources of materials. And of course, we realize that this is not technically true. Within our lifetimes, within a dozen lifetimes, maybe it's true, but eventually there's only so many atoms of each element on the planet, and the vast majority of them are not economically available. So at some point, there is a limit to this. But at least in the foreseeable future, well beyond an era where fossil fuels would be viable, the point that they're making is that this material is available. They look at recycling, and as you can imagine, while we're building this infrastructure out, there would be really huge demands for all of these materials. But as they go into service, that demand would level out and eventually decrease. This is the demand for new mined material. It would level out at the rate of economic growth, and then decrease as the older vehicles and older infrastructure gets recycled and offsets the amounts that would need to be mined. And then finally settle at this steady state that would grow again at the rate of growth of the world economy. So put another way, in the early days, there would be a lot of mined ores and not a whole lot of recycling. But by 2050, there would be just a little bit of mined ore and a lot more recycling. And so then they conclude with the statement that we saw earlier. Here's the 6 steps to fully electrify the world and make it so that we're no longer putting carbon in the atmosphere from fossil fuels. To summarize, the secret plan was to build a pricey electric vehicle, use that money to build affordable electric vehicles, and establish them as a winning category in the car marketplace. Part 2 was to create self-earning EVs, and of course to compete in ever-growing segments of the car market. And Part 3 was to electrify the world with renewables and save 29% along the way. So what's missing? 2 things: global economic growth and land use. Let's start with global economic growth. Tesla assumes that world energy use is 6 times that of the US. But today, the world population is 24 times that of the US. Now, both of those statements are true. Today, the world energy use is 6 times that of the US, and the world population is 24 times as big. So the US is a giant consumer. And by 2050, of course, we're going to see some world population growth. There's 8 billion people now. There will be some 10 billion people by mid-century. And we're looking at a world population that's 30 times the current US population by then. Rising incomes are a fact. Southeast Asia got much richer over the past 30 years. And that could easily happen in Africa and South America over the next 30 years. So rising incomes will push energy use towards 30 times the United States energy use. That's 5 times Tesla's estimate. So when we plug that factor of 5 into Tesla's numbers, and if we converted the whole world to renewable electric power at a full American level of affluence, then we're looking at the cost of 5 times what Tesla was suggesting. This is a problem that we need to model, because in a world that is permanently divided among the haves and the have-nots by a really wide margin, is a very dangerous world to live in. So let's get into the unspoken problem, which is land use. As it stands today, we use half the world's land area, and we have wiped out half the living biomass of the planet. Now, since plants account for 82% of that biomass, and plants are the sole energy source for nearly all life on Earth, cutting the biomass in half cuts life's income source in half. Now imagine if your income was cut in half, or if your country's income was cut in half. This would immediately become the biggest problem in your life. We don't hear as much about this problem as we do about climate change, because even though it's a very clear number, the consequences aren't so clearly articulated. But they are severe. It's mass extinctions, it's a loss of resilience worldwide. It's basically a world that's half as alive as it once was. The second thing to know about land use is that from antiquity to now, small layered gardens have improved soil and yielded 10 times more than plantation agriculture. In his book, Dirt, The Erosion of Civilizations, David R. Montgomery provides example after example of this throughout the world, going back to ancient Rome. And he, as well as the other authors cited on this page, point out that as it stands today, 40% of the world's soils have been damaged by large-scale agriculture. Now, the majority of that land area that humans use is devoted to large-scale agriculture. Soil depletion is a threat to our existence. Historically, we only take good care of the soil when we live near our food sources. So for efficiency reasons and soil conservation reasons, we need to move food production closer to where we live. So let's make the case for urban agriculture. Cities occupy 1.3 to 2.8% of the world's land area, depending on where you draw the boundaries. And they hold half the world's population, a number that will grow to 68% by 2050, according to the United Nations. Now you may wonder where we're going to find the room in cities to grow all of our food. It turns out that over 50% of most cities is devoted to cars. In fact, according to parkingreform.org, parking alone can account for anywhere from 25 to as much as 50% of some city cores, as you can see in this graph here. And when you add the setbacks, green strips, lawns, and other buffers that are all responses to cars in cities, it turns out that cars and the architectural responses to cars occupies as much as 80% of cities. Meanwhile, public and active transit use 1/8 to 1/30 as much space as cars. If you look on this chart down here, you'll see that cars and mixed traffic can carry anywhere from 1,500 to 2,000 people per lane per hour, whereas a bike lane can carry as many as 12,000 people per hour, and transit can carry as much as all the way up to 60,000 people per hour. In addition to that, low-rise, mixed-use neighborhoods can use a 20th as much space as detached houses. So changing from a car-centric, single-family architecture to transit-oriented design leaves lots of room for other uses. So with these thoughts in mind, I think we're ready to Edenize Tesla's master plan. Step 1 is to free up that 80% of urban space with transit-oriented development. That is to say, replace all of the cars with rail and put the rail underground where possible. Step 2, use that space for urban agriculture. And third, use the space freed up from big agriculture to restore the lost half of Earth's biomass and make the world as alive as it once was. And I just want to point out that this is not deprivation. This is creating a wonderful, safe, quiet, clean, healthy, convenient environment to live in. Now let's see how these assumptions propagate into the numbers that we would use to Edenize the Tesla master plan. Going all in on rail offsets 1/3 of air miles because 1/3 of flights are short-haul trips of less than 1,500 kilometers. And at that distance, rail, especially high-speed rail, is just plain faster when you include all of the nonsense of dealing with an airport. Rail also uses a 28th of the energy of cars, a 10th of the material, and lasts 4 times longer. Now, I've put some of the detailed calculations in the description, and while you're there, if you see the subscribe button, go ahead and click that so you don't miss out on any more deep dives like this. With rail, also, we're not using batteries, we're just using continuous power, which is a lot less resource intensive. Meanwhile, in the building sector, going multifamily mixed use with heat pumps changes the Tesla number from 1/3 to 1/4 as much energy because with a multifamily dwelling, you're sharing a roof and walls, and therefore your dwelling is a lot less exposed to the elements. And based on the shorter utility runs, these buildings use maybe half the material as houses. At some point, I'll do a detailed material breakdown, but for rough estimation purposes, let's say half. So overall, they're using 1/4 the material over time. Without cars, fossil fuels, and McMansions, there's a lot less manufacturing, mining, and shipping. I hope to eventually do a detailed breakdown, but for now, I'm just going to have to go with an educated guess. Maybe a fifth based on the fact that so much of a city is dedicated to transportation, and we're using 40 times less material when we switch to rail. And multifamily housing gets us almost all the way there, using about 1/4 as much material in the long run. Let's just guess 1/5 for now, and take these numbers and plug them into the Tesla plan. So here's the global energy flow by sector. Compare it to the similar diagram that Tesla developed for the Part 3 plan. The difference is that in the Edenized version, we have an affluent population of 10 billion people. We don't have a world where some people are using much, much less energy than others. We're all basically using about the same amount of energy. And this had some really interesting consequences. First of all, it did require a little bit more energy production than the Tesla plan. For reasons I went into in the second of the Edenicity energy videos, there'd be a certain amount of biomass available, so it would go up a little bit from the Tesla estimate. Renewable energy, we would need 26% more, and all of these other numbers are slightly bigger as well. To me, one of the most interesting things was that aviation ends up being quite a bit bigger in this future where everybody's equally affluent. I'm assuming basically that the entire world is getting around by plane to the same extent as Americans do today. And so the aviation sector has grown, but it is being supplied with renewable energy, with synthetic fuel generation. So again, I want to stress this is no longer carbon-producing aviation. transportation. It's not putting any more carbon in the atmosphere, but it ends up being a much bigger slice of the pie. On the other hand, surface transport ends up being tiny compared to Tesla, which rolled all of transportation together in this figure here. So for the Edenicity plan, the total transportation budget is 28 petawatt hours per year, which is more than twice as much as Tesla. That's the biggest increase. And again, very similar curtailment, similar in every other way. Now let's Edenize this figure from the Tesla plan. Again, this is for a global affluent population of 10 billion people, which would be absolutely amazing. This is not 10 billion people living in cities the way they are today with noise and pollution and cars hurtling about. This is a city where children can walk to school without ever encountering a car. These are cities where the air, water, and food are clean, and transportation costs are 10 times lower than they are with cars, and everything is so close by that you're only making half as many transit trips as before, and the transit trips are half as long as before, again due to the higher density. So in that world, to have 10 billion people living in relative affluence gets me really excited as to the possibilities of what they'll invent and discover and how far we can go as a civilization at that point. And it's potentially just around the corner. Let's look at the numbers here. Tesla added up the costs of everything and came up with 10 trillion. They actually did this in this very detailed table. So what I did for my estimate was basically divide every row into either generation or storage categories, and then plug that back into generation and storage categories over here. So here are the 6 steps of the Tesla plan, with the Tesla versions in gray and the Edenicity versions in green. In some cases, such as the switch to electric vehicles, you can see in both charts, Edenicity uses far less power generation and far, far less energy storage. But in other categories, such as heat pumps, Edenicity uses far more than Tesla, because now we're supplying the needs of the entire world. And by the way, I think more detailed modeling will bring the heat pump number way down for reasons I'll get into right at the end today. So when we add up the power generation, Edenicity ends up consuming more than twice as much power as Tesla to bring the whole world up to affluence. But on the energy storage side, Edenicity ends up using a little bit less storage, mainly because we're not using 1 billion autonomous electric vehicles throughout the world. We're using rail, which is far more efficient. Edenicity ends up spending about $5 trillion on power generation, so more than twice as much as the Tesla plan, but it ends up spending a little bit less money on energy storage. And so the total investment to Edenize the whole world is $12.6 trillion, which is of course a little bit more than the Tesla plan, but a little bit less than the status quo, and probably a lot less given that the world's economy is projected to double by 2050. With these thoughts in mind, let's look at what the next steps ought to be for Tesla. First of all, Tesla should invest in rail. They already own the Boring Company, so they could really go all in on underground metro rail. I would also suggest that they look into maglev, which China seems to be having good results with after a long period of development, and may turn out to be lower cost because of fewer moving parts and a lot less wear and tear on those parts. Tesla should, as quickly as it can, shift from cars to rail, because with cities competing worldwide for talent and starting to get the urbanism message and think about doing many of the things I've talked about today, it's becoming more and more apparent. Let's face it, the private cars are so 20th century. Okay, look, if they like cars, then what they ought to do is invest in service vehicles that are governed to 20 kilometers per hour or 12 miles an hour so that we have far fewer fatal collisions. And then finally, I think a really huge growth area for Tesla would be to go into sustainable aviation, all of the things that they mentioned in their plan. And the next steps for Edenicity would be to model the industrial energy use in the kind of detail that we saw in the Tesla plan. And finally answer the question, can cities supply all of their energy, including for industry, within city limits? Once that's done, I can finish part 4 of the Edenicity Energy series. If you tap that bell icon, I'll let you know when it's available. And then move on to optimize the system with carbon negative construction and passive building climates, which are areas where permaculture really shines. Okay, here's that Edenicity energy playlist that I mentioned, and here's a little bit more information on the details of Edenicity transit design. And if you're curious how all of the different parts of the Edenicity plan fit together, have a look at the Edenicity reference design, which is available in the description. And just a little word of warning, it's a very abstract schematic. Obviously, real cities wouldn't be so square and angular. It's just easier to understand. That's all I've got for today. I hope it's given you some hope for the future. Take care, stay green. See you next time.